This evening it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Jason Middlebrook to our final MFA Fine Arts talk for the 2016-17 academic year. Jason's an artist who gathers creative inspiration from both nature and technology and transfers their complex relationships into works of sculpture, installation, painting, and large-scale drawings, and lots of wood, lots of stuff on wood. Jason's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally at venues such as the New Museum of Contemporary Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, Mass MoCA in North Adams, Mass, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in Connecticut, Galleria Paolo Bonzano Arte Contemporanea in Rome, Museo de Arte de El Salvador, Nylon Gallery in London, and Charlotte Lund Gallery in Stockholm, Sweden, among many others. He was a 2010 recipient of the Joan Mitchell Foundation grant and the Pollock Krasner Foundation grant in 2016. His MTA public commission, Brooklyn Seeds, was named one of the best public art works in the United States in 2012 by the Americans for the Arts Convention. He has also worked with organizations such as RX Art, Wave Hill, the Drawing Center, Smack Melon, and many others. Jason received a BA in Fine Arts from UC Santa Cruz and an MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute in 1984, back when it was great. In 94-95, he was a participant in the Whitney Independent Study Program, and in 2009-10, he participated in the Lapsus residency in Stockholm. He has been represented by a number of excellent galleries in New York and elsewhere over the years, and he is currently represented by, try to do this all in one breath, David Smith Gallery in Denver, Gallery 16 in San Francisco, Laura Reynolds Gallery in Austin, Texas, Monica Maloche Gallery in Chicago, Ameringer, McHenry, and Yohe here in New York, Jeff Bailey Gallery in Hudson, and Gallery Pack in Milan. Please join me in welcoming Jason Middlebrook.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Thank you, Mark. All those galleries are made up. I don't work with any of those galleries. All right, so I have a lot to show you. I'm really pretty schizophrenic in my art practice. And I'm going to break things down into about three distinctive groups. I studied painting. My father's a sculptor. My mother is a native plant kind of advocate in California. She has a nonprofit. So I come from the West Coast. And I studied painting. I grew up in this artistic family in California. But as I evolved, I became much more of a site-specific artist. Yet I still make paintings. I still draw. I had a teacher in graduate school tell me once that I'm conceptually promiscuous. And that's kind of the best way for me to go about this. A lot of people, after they see this presentation, they say, oh my God, you're all over the place. But there's some continuity and there's a lot of major threads that intersect one another. And I'm going to kind of just start, you're going to look at about a 10 to 12 year span of work that I've been making. This project, I'm starting at this point because it's a very site-specific project. There was a show at the MCA 2010-ish, kind of responding to Alexander Calder. The MCA has got a large kind of holding of Alexander Calder's work. They were looking at artists, contemporary artists that were responding to Calder, and so I was invited to do a project there. And I really got into the history of Chicago and how Chicago was rebuilt. Chicago was this amazing architectural kind of template after the fire. So I scanned all the neighborhoods of Chicago, and I started collecting objects throughout the neighborhoods of Chicago. And I kind of set up this criteria that I was going to just collect kind of wood, kind of an organic material that had a function in homes in Chicago and that had gone through this life and been expired and kind of dumped on the streets. So this is kind of a storage facility that I started collecting all these objects: three-legged chairs, mantles, window sashes. This is a spindle for the electric company, cribs, and so I set up these kind of rules that I was going to spend weeks on end collecting this debris. A mantle. Here's some lattice. I got into a few Hyde Park, Oak Park, some of Frank Lloyd Wright's students. And so I went back to my studio and I made this kind of model in my studio that had a relationship to Calder, but it also had a relationship to the kind of debris versus this log that I found in a mill about 75 miles east of Chicago, a mill that fed Chicago through most of the turn of the century. So I picked out this kind of 2,000-pound maple log, and the idea was to try to find this equivalent amount of debris that had been discarded in Chicago. This is the model and how the sculpture would be positioned. I went back to Chicago and I started to assemble this with this kind of cluster on one side and the equivalent weight on the other. A lot of what I'm going to show you tonight is I'm a real process-oriented artist, and I find that it's nice to give a little story about how these things kind of evolve. So here we are installing this kind of cluster that is kind of exploding out on itself. You can see ironing boards. You can see the bottom is a floor from a Frank Lloyd Wright house that was being renovated. I really had a blast with this project because it was kind of scavenger, antique dealer, artist, sculptor, engineer. We had one hanging point that was established for this Jeff Koons heart that was put into the ceiling, up into the top of this I-beam. So I had to keep this sculpture under a certain weight. I think 5,000 pounds was the weight of the heart, and so I had to stay under that. And the log was really, there's like the little cluster. You've got this dresser. The drawers are actually hollow. There's some superstructure in there. There it is, kind of balancing. The log was interesting because I cut the log in half, and the museum required that the log have a superstructure inside. That's what the bolts tie into a steel superstructure. And so down here you kind of see there's like a seam where we split the log, and I was so kind of obsessive that I saved the bark, and then we hid the bark on the seam that goes the entire length of the log. So we split the log open like cutting a banana in half. And then at the very end, the sculptures didn't weigh the same amount. So I was able to get up here and pour sand into the log, which was pretty cool. We left a hole so I could get the sculptures to equal themselves out. And the title of the piece is a mouthful. From the forest to the mill to the store to the home to the streets and back again. So it was this real process project about the kind of history of these objects, how they're discarded, their source, where they come from, at what point do we get tired of the things that we live with, that we need something else, and the kind of functionality of those objects. And so that project led to a bunch of these kind of architectural, I want to call them renovations, but they're these kind of architectural identity pieces I did. This one is at Art House in Austin. Art House was going through a large renovation, and they invited me to come in and remove all the debris and make a kind of comment about the history of this building. This building downtown Austin was in its like sixth generation of identity. It was a toy store, it was a movie theater, it was a department store. And so the architect had planned to cut all these slices out of the building. And I was so inspired by kind of Austin's history with food and being this progressive city in central Texas that I invited people to send in recipes, homemade recipes, recipes that were passed down from each generation. So you can see these slices that are existing in the building. This is the existing architecture that they didn't mess around with. And so on the opposing wall, I took the recipes, and I had 168 recipes. And the idea was to have this almost like Judy Chicago kind of dinner party. And so each sculpture represented like a table setting. And the name of the project was called More Art About Buildings and Food, which was kind of inspired by the 1977 Talking Heads record. And so here's some of the table settings. I worked with a couple glass blowers in Austin. I recycled a lot of the wine bottles from restaurants. This is an Absolute Vodka kind of platter. Here's some Martinelli's apple juice dinnerware. And so and then this was the original sign, the Texas Art Association. Those became benches. Here's some of the wine bottles I turned into kind of these chandeliers. This was the old railing from the department store as you came upstairs. And there's the existing art house after the renovation. Here's more. And then there was a large drawing of a 2x10 I found, kind of an oversized drawing. I spent about 3 months in Austin working on this project. So the exhibition opened in kind of a still form, and then there was a series of kind of dinner parties scheduled with guest chefs and like a gingerbread making house kind of workshop. And then this chef came in and did this kind of slow food presentation. I was proud that he ended up getting top chef that year, and he volunteered his time. That was pretty sweet. Here is another slow food presentation. And then at the opening, I auditioned a few bands, and I picked a band, and they specifically had to only play songs from that record. So it was a total control freak, a controlled kind of installation. Here's more gingerbread presentations. And then, let's see, that's the last one. So that was kind of the grand opening of this transformation of Art House from their old space to their new space. And then I'm going to go through a series of pieces that are just one-offs, individuals. This kind of Calder-esque piece predated the Calder show before. I really got into kind of Calder's mobiles, so I wanted to make one with just driftwood. This is wood from all over the world, mobile, it's entitled. And then this is a series of 500 cast concrete kind of bottles from Gatorade, Tide, motor oil, Smart Water. I started thinking about sediment and archaeology, and it's been a big theme in a lot of my art to kind of think about future and past generations and what's going to happen to all the plastic, in 500 years or 1,000 years. And I kept imagining this idea that a bottle gets thrown out the window and it sits there for a couple hundred years until it fills with sediment, and then a few more hundred years until it actually becomes a petrified shape. So I just started pouring colored concrete in all these bottles. And it's amazing when you start to look at the differences between the corporations and the symbols that they put on the Gatorade versus Coke versus Tide. And I showed these in about 6 or 7 different configurations. And that kind of led to a series of drawings. I think this is called Inspired on the Countless Trips from My Kitchen to My Studio. And it's a combination of Juarez, Mexico, and a couple other shanty towns, Soweto in South Africa. There's a few different shanty towns that are all kind of crushed into one mound. This drawing is called Vein. This drawing here I think is a continuation of this drawing, even though it's separate. So this is called, it's something like you can take the country out of the boy, but you can't take the boy out of the country, or something stupid like that. I can't remember what it is. It's a really big drawing. It's about 15 feet. Here's a couple others. Right after I had kids, I went through this whole kind of altruistic bird phase, which you'll see this throughout my work. I tend to sometimes get a little cheesy, but it pays the rent. And so for some reason, birds and mushrooms tend to pay the mortgage from time to time. It's a good thing for you to learn. If you're ever completely broke, just pick birds and mushrooms. You'll make a ton of money. Anyway, this is the log jam on the Hudson. I tend to take on these kind of exercises that are months on end. So this drawing is pretty big. It's an 8-foot drawing. It's been shown a few different times. For many years it was a graphite drawing, but recently it's started to become some color has come into it. I think there's a few artists out there. I think Glenn Brown once said his paintings are never really finished, which drives most art historians nuts. But this drawing I don't think is ever finished. I continue to work on it from time to time. Here's a couple more. And then this goes back to the mushroom thing. I got invited to make a benefit, to make an addition for the Aspen Museum in honor of Fred Tomaselli. And in the early part of Fred's work, it was all psychotropics. It was psilocybin and marijuana and pharmaceuticals that he was burying in his paintings. And so I just started doing all these mushrooms drawings and kind of treating them like they were different. Each one was a different object. And literally for the next 5 years, I did a tremendous amount of mushrooms. Not actual mushrooms. I didn't take mushrooms, but I made a lot of mushrooms. And I mean a lot, to the point where I was kind of embarrassed about them. But in this kind of Jeff Koonsian way, I had a studio, I had employees, I had this kind of production and assembly line going with these mushrooms. And for me, it was kind of, it was a way to exercise a lot of kind of artistic demons, because I like these projects where you have a subject that you can kind of beat to death, and you can kind of saturate all your ideas into this one form. So I would be like, well, why don't we try slate? Why don't I try blondes? Why don't I try illuminating them? Why don't I try, different scale shifts, a big one, a small one. Let's work with a glass blower and make additional lamps. So what I kind of like about it is that at first I wasn't proud of the kind of subject matter, because it was so Alice in Wonderland, it was so 60s, it had all this kind of kitsch weight loaded to it. So I treated it like a challenge. I'll say, okay, I'm going to turn a mushroom into something interesting. How can I do that? So anyway, the lesson I think there is, as an artist, sometimes you don't know the path you're going to take, and you don't know which way it's going to lead you, and you land on something, and you kind of, at least in my case, I beat it to death, but on the other back end of it, you get something out of it, and you learn something about yourself. And I make a lot of art. I'm really prolific, and it's not always good, but I like the idea of volume. I like the idea of kind of beating an idea to death to see what you can come out of it. You'll see more mushrooms coming. These are some computer digital kind of mock-ups for a subway commission. I had applied for one subway commission. I didn't get it. I applied for a second one. I didn't get it. And the third one I got. And it's an amazing opportunity. It's one of the best public art programs in America. The MTA subway art program is wonderful, because there's so many opportunities for artists, and it's so site specific based on the station. So I applied for this. They worked with me, and we picked the right station. It's an above ground station. So as you enter into the subway, it's on the way to Coney Island. You enter at the ground level, and then you kind of go up these steps. And the idea behind this commission was every one of these native plants is selected from Brooklyn, and the seed pods are floating in the air, and the seed pods are here, and they're kind of a metaphor for the commuter, the subway traveler. And the MTA is really smart. They don't let the artists actually touch this. It's all farmed out to fabricators. So I got a chance to work with a real mosaic fabricator. The piece was made in Italy, and you get to kind of manage your own project, which was a really good was a good experience for future projects that I'm doing now, to kind of learn how to manage a big commission where you've got insurance and people and a site and engineers and bureaucracy and all the stuff that they don't teach you about in art school. And so that led to a series of, I discovered this mill about an hour from my house in western Massachusetts that specifically deals in hardwood, trees like maple, elm, oak, indigenous trees to the Northeast, no exotics, no trees from California, tree farms basically from the Northeast. This tree here on the left is beech. This is a large slab. It's about 6 feet by 5 feet. That on the right, I believe, is maple. And the idea was, I always felt kind of a little confused about painting. I'm always between the wall and the floor. And I had come from California and this kind of surfboard tradition. I was always a big fan of John McCracken. I had spent time in Northern Australia, and so I was really turned on by Aboriginal art. And I was trying to kind of occupy a space that existed between here and here. Most of these lean. Most of this one here is 14 feet. That one down there is 12 and a half. I was looking at people like Frank Stella, Agnes Martin. It was like I was reacting to my own kind of whimsical practice, such as the mushrooms, and trying to superimpose kind of my own grid on top of this beautiful wood grain. And I kind of stumbled upon something because the tree is just, the pieces of wood are so magnificent. And I felt like I just had to be kind of a visitor on top of these pieces of wood. But all the while kind of looking at people like Stella and Agnes Martin, kind of looking at Ellsworth Kelly, really hardcore minimalists. This piece of wood is like 4.5 inches thick. This is a big piece of wood. It's been exhibited a few times in different climates, and I'm always worried it's going to just separate and pop, but it's held in there. Here's another one. I kept trying to play with kind of geometry and how it collides with the organic kind of compressed time. I always use this metaphor that mankind is kind of trying to put a skin over the earth, like the asphalt or the sidewalk that exists in a city, and that sidewalk is constantly being broken up by weeds or tree roots or erosion. And so the paint kind of sits right on top. It's just kind of visiting the organic form of these shapes. And it allowed me to kind of leave the rectangle, leave the square, and deal with this live edge. So I started going to this mill, and I started buying a lot of this wood and bringing it back to my studio and doing these drawings and looking at Bridget Riley, looking at like hardcore minimalists and kind of op art from the 60s and 70s. And then I started looking at geology and going back to some of my interest in kind of sediment and Smithson and entropy and that kind of thing. It's all acrylic. I got better and better at kind of real hard edge painting. This one here is called Something Left. So the idea is maybe there was a larger painting there. It's tape, but it's not masking. It's a different kind of tape, but it's a lot of matte medium. It's a lot of razors. The surface, I sand it down to like 600 grit, so it gets really smooth like glass. Here's another one. And kind of like the mushrooms, like the sky was the limit. You know, I could sit with the planks in my studio. I built a studio specifically designed to take a 20-foot plank. This piece was like the painting I've been trying to make my whole life. I was really proud of this painting because it's about the non-painting. And so this is all one tree, curly maple. This is 9 feet by 9 feet. And this tree was milled. The mill that I go to, imagine the tree is stacked up like kind of sandwich meat. And you can buy the whole tree or you can select parts of the tree. So this tree was maybe 7 pieces and I bought 4 pieces. So imagine the tree is like this. The tree goes through the mill and then it's leaned up and stacked. So sometimes the first or second pieces aren't so interesting, but the heart of the tree is really interesting. And so I was looking at Frank Stella, I was thinking about the black painting, I was thinking about that negative space and how powerful what we can't see becomes when we give it a painting, when we give it a border. And I feel really proud about this painting because it took a certain amount of restraint and I wanted it to be kind of a signature statement about this whole body of work. And it was the first time I kind of got off the floor and on the wall. Here's a little step of the process. That entire piece of wood is covered in tape. I do a really precise drawing, and then my assistants cut it out. I've also learned over the years that sometimes other people make your art a lot better than you do. And it's a really important thing because you're going to go down that road and you're going to say, well, like, I want to make this out of porcelain, but I don't know how to do it. And someone's got to help me do it, or I have to collaborate, or I got to work with a porcelain artist. And I have no problem giving up control. It took me a long time to learn that skill, but it's really important to give up control. And other people oftentimes execute your art much better than you can. Some people have a hard time with that statement because their art is so personal. Painting is so personal, or sculpture or performance is so personal. But sometimes the idea is just as personal and other people can execute it better. I'm showing you a lot of these to really pound home the idea that I can't stop making them. There's kind of an idea of a drawing. There'll be a kind of a sketch or something, and then the beauty of this is I try it out. If it doesn't work, I sand over it. Sometimes black works really well, or white. Here's a real kind of Agnes Martin influence one. This is called Corner Steps, where it's just 2 shades of brown and 2 shades of orange going up the side. Here's a photograph. We've often seen this in the city, but I found it and it kind of made me think about the planks in relationship to the last piece, this kind of broken line. There's definitely kind of a California surfboard, snowboard thing sometimes happening. Fashion might be part of it. The one on the right's a little more connected to kind of the Aboriginal geometric thing. There's all white on the right. There's like 12 different colors that go in and out of light to dark. Here's a show with a friend, a 2-person show. And then that leads me back to another site-specific thing. Mass Mocha came to me and they wanted to do a big installation. I had always wanted to do a mobile that was a waterfall. And Mass Mocha is the kind of place that says yes to the craziest stuff because they have a lot of space, hardly any money, but tons of resources. So digging around one of the buildings in Mass Mocha, I found these giant pieces of styrofoam. An artist had carved the Boston Harbor years ago and left the foam in one of their buildings. So I kind of was playing with this idea of falling water, that I wanted to make this kind of stationary mobile that recycled the water within the space. And so we started with some pools, started welding up this thing, putting it together. and it was kind of an adventure. It was a real challenge to make this thing, but then in the end we got it to work. So this is pretty cool. The water drops in here, it goes through the floor, goes up the wall, shoots across this I-beam and drops into the top one here. This one cascades here to cascades here to cascades here. And it was a real, it was a challenge to make this piece, but I've never made a piece of art that makes people have to urinate when they come into a museum. And so that was, that was a big surprise. And it also created a certain amount of humidity, and that created a problem with other works in the show. So we had to dial it back. I worked with an aquatics guy, and it was so cool, the amount of energy that it took to get this water up to here. There's a huge mechanism underneath the floor of the museum. And the pressure was dialed so far down because if we turned it up, this would just spray and destroy the floor. So I kind of like these engineering challenges where you've got to fine tune this thing. So, and the shows at MassMocha run for 10 months, which is awesome because you get a lot of exposure. You can see the water there coming here off that tier. And of course, for me, it wasn't powerful enough. I wanted to turn it up, but they kept turning it down. We had real problems with water collecting and coming down and hitting the floor. The pool up here, the water wanted to go this way. Water's impervious. If you decide to work with water, I met with someone today that's working with glass. She just stepped out, but water's a dangerous material to work with. It's completely unforgiving. Here it is going into the floor. We had this kind of basin here that's completely submerged in silicone to protect the water from jumping into here. Little bits of water we get here, and then in one day you've got a puddle ruining the floor. So the control on this thing was weeks of fine tuning it, so the water did exactly what we wanted it to do. The next body of work, I was still kind of on this recycling mode. I was going to the dump a lot. So I started collecting these tires, and I would take them to my fiberglass guy. He would fiberglass them. And I started mosaicing these tires. Both of my grandfathers worked for Goodyear in the Midwest, so I felt I had right to make art about tires. You can see some of the fiberglass in here where we would coat and encapsulate the entire tire in fiberglass. I guess I mean to say it in that that they had spent their entire life working for the Goodyear Corporation. I remember my dad telling me that when his father retired, they gave him a tie clip, you know, and it always stuck with me that you spend your entire life working for this corporation and they give you a party and a tie clip, you know, and you know, I feel like I say that because tires it's part of my subconscious, this coming from the Midwest and coming from this kind of working class part of Michigan where I was born, even though I grew up in a much different environment in California. So it's kind of like you experience these things through osmosis, you experience them subconsciously. You hear the stories that your parents talk about, and growing up in small town America where everyone works for the same factory, it's kind of a cliche. And I was always turned on by Rauschenberg. You'll see Rauschenberg's influence later. And I think I was approaching it in more of an environmental way, but by saying I've got the rights to use tires as a image was kind of justifying my desire to make work about Goodyear, about our relationship to the automobile. It's a very American, the tire is a very American thing. All the time. Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, we talk about that all the time. What does privilege really mean? You know, what does it mean? And like I just watched this Dave LaChapelle comedy hour, and everyone's giving him slack. And you know, at what point can you make work about something that you have no relationship to? Are you only allowed to make work about something that you've experienced or something that you're upset about? And I think it's especially now because everything's up for grabs and it's a really political time right now. I tend to mask it by saying all the things that people are upset about now are basically human conditions. Things like sexism and racism and homophobia, those are things we've invented. I'm trying to be inspired by nature. I don't want to go down that road to be inspired by those things because I find that the more energy we give them, the more power they have. And nature for me is far more complex than those human problems. Not to discredit those human problems, but the kind of theme of my work is that nature is the guiding force behind it. And the ultimate force behind that is that we don't truly understand nature. We're all kind of afraid of it. So back to process. Here's more toxic things happening in my studio that end up becoming this. Here's another one. Here's a big piece I did for the Albright Knox in Buffalo. Here's a tree in my creek that fell down that was kind of the inspiration. So I went out and made a smaller one and kind of extended its root system. I was asked to do a sculpture for the Albright Knox in Buffalo. As many people probably don't know, Olmsted designed the park system in Buffalo after he did Central Park. And he planted over 20,000 trees in Buffalo. So I wanted to make a piece about kind of Olmsted and the relationship that the parks had to Buffalo. So many people think of Buffalo as the Queen City that's snowed in all the time, and but Buffalo has this amazing park system. So here I am welding this piece, kind of like this big, sci-fi War of the Worlds monster. And then the next phase is each piece gets covered in foam, and then each piece is covered in fiberglass like a pile of tentacles. It all bolts together. And then I got a wonderful thing called interns, a lot of them. And I ended up hiring a bunch of my interns. Usually, because I live upstate, I work with a lot of kids from Bennington and Bard. And so here we are in Buffalo putting the piece together, but there was still a lot to finish. So I kind of made this makeshift, Leonardo da Vinci scaffold. And then there's the piece. It's called Underlife, which is really about the celebration of the root system and not so much the tree above. And there's a nice bench here that you can look out at the lake that Olmsted designed. There's about 6 primary reflective tiles on there. So it was kind of this kind of bedazzled tree root. I kept thinking about wet tree roots, the life force beneath the ground. This piece took a while. This piece took 2 years. And then that led to a lot of times I get invited to go to a site, whether it be a private collection or an institution, and I met some people that were affiliated with Art House, and they wanted me to come to Santa Fe. These people are like dream collectors because they wanted me to spend time on their property, and they wanted me to take a year to come up with an idea. It was like, the ultimate collector, that they take their time. Their whole process was to get to know the artist and have the artist respond to their landscape, to their land. So here's their house. I spent about a week hiking, just kind of studying the landscape. I got into these pinyon pines that drop off these beautiful pine cones. And so I proposed a couple different ideas to them. One was to enlarge this pine cone to kind of celebrate the seed behind this kind of native tree of New Mexico. And so I kind of plopped it on one of their hikes. I went to Bangkok to produce it, just because of the craftsmanship in Bangkok was so good. And there's the wax pine cone. It was kind of a mathematical problem to make 56 petals that all fit into the same kind of shaft. And there we are, kind of patina in it. And here it is getting installed in Santa Fe. And then I got to go up inside the crane to see it from way up high. So it really did look like a small pine cone in the end. Here's another site-specific project. The tires. There's an old racetrack in the Hamptons that is now a golf course. And so these tires are kind of interspersed with normal tires that are out there. This was kind of a fun project. Back to the mushroom. I'd done so many small ones, but I thought it was time to do a big one. Here we are kind of carving the form. There it is before it gets fiberglassed. Then there's like a spigot that I had to make in order to tile it. And there's the collector that sponsored it. It's kind of a funny picture. He's not that small. It's not that big. The slate is all from tile slate from the turn of the century up in Saratoga Springs. I found some tile slate that was on a roof for a couple hundred years. Here's another one in New Jersey. And then here's back to the tire piece for Rauschenberg. I always loved that piece that he made with the Angora goat, so I kind of made a riff on one. This is bronze and paint, and it was tough to make a goat, so I actually had to find a goat, and it was tough to take a mold of a goat, and I found hairspray for horses, actually, believe it or not, to keep the hair for show horses. They make hairspray. And so I had to spray the goat in order to get some of the hair, to capture the hair. Here's some more stumps. Here's another mosaic plank. And then the plank pieces have now led into like a series of wall pieces. Kind of still dealing with that live edge. These are all roughly about this big. They're smaller than the planks overall. So as you can see, there's kind of a pattern developing of my schizophrenia here. It's always going back and forth between the studio and these kind of site-specific projects. I had made a series of birdhouse kind of colonies, and this one's made up of 145 birdhouses. All different kind of historic and non-historic components of architecture, the pyramids. I think there's the Parthenon over there. A lot of classic barns, the Kwanzaa hut, some graffiti. These are all cast aluminum. That's a tenement building. There's the Transamerica building with some graffiti on it. And then there's the final. And the idea here is that it is inhabited by birds, and this was in a cluster of aspen groves. Here's a Farnsworthy house here. This is a Chicago tower. Here's a Pueblo there. There's a couple pyramids. There's another tenement house. There's the Alamo. This was a fun project to make. Everything had to be made out of wood and then cast in aluminum. Here's a painting that was the inspiration for a wall drawing at the MFA. This is still up. Right now it's up for one more year. It's kind of a show about geometric landscapes. This was fun to do. The shift in scale was a challenge. But it's their number one selfie, which is kind of something nice to say. This is going back to the pine cone client again. The second half of the project was what happens to the pinyon pines after about 150 years. They die. So I got to go back to the property and look at some of the pinions. I made a sample to bring on the airplane, which was kind of fun with the airport security. And then here's the finished product, was this tree. This was more of a challenge than the mushroom because I had to put the stones on edge. But it was the best way to kind of capture the dead growth of these pinyon pines. And I really love working in this capacity because you leave the studio, you get to the site, and then you let the rules of the site dictate the inspiration behind the project. And here's another one in southern Idaho. So, you know, it's this like classic kind of practice of spending time in nature, then going back to the studio, fabricating these structures, then become kind of an homage to these dead trees. This was also slate. Here's a couple of my assistants. We're working on a reclaimed Etsy corporation in Brooklyn wanted me to make a painting on all their farm tables that they've been feeding their employees since the inception of their company. So that was kind of fun to take apart all their farm tables and kind of make this landscape painting for their cafeteria. I'm really into these projects where there's, you know, like I said, there's rules in play. This is an ongoing project that I was in this show in Santa Fe, the Site Santa Fe Biennial, and the theme dealt with kind of borders and commerce. And I've always wanted to make a barter general store, kind of going back to the 1800s where your money's no good here, that you kind of need something, you go down to the general store and you trade it. Trade labor for rope, or you trade feed for, you know, a birdhouse. So I invited about 50 artists to submit work to start the trading, basically. And I converted the inside of the shipping container into this kind of structure, recycled pallets, old barn board. I used a graffiti artist did the ceiling. But the idea is that you kind of browse and you get inspired, and if you want something, you've got to trade, you've got to make something of equal value. And so the piece went on a little tour out in the Southwest. It was in the Santa Fe Biennial, and then it went on a university campus for a semester. So the students got really engaged in it. They were allowed to participate with it and make objects, trade objects, curate things with it. There's a stained glass window in it. Here's Lydia. She was my kind of curator at New Mexico State for a semester. And so there had to be a real, you know, she had to learn how to say no, to keep the criteria high, to keep the caliber of objects at a nice level. Here it is next to the art department. And that initial photograph that I showed you is, Mark would have seen this. This is where we had the party, Mark. So I was pushing to get this finished when I turned 50. That's where the bands played on that stage. So the container came back from New Mexico, and now it's open for trades. We're gonna, like once a month, it's open for trades. It's kind of a cool project. It's called Your General Store. There's a website, yourgeneralstore.org, where all the objects are inventoried. This artist made concrete silverware. I thought those were pretty cool. People really got into it. There was like a real challenge to make things that that had a high kind of criteria. Some of it was junk, but the longer it's open, the more people. It's a real process. You go there, you have this experience, you find something you like, and then you go back home and you make something to trade. So it's kind of, it started as a general store, and now it's kind of a revolving barter art project. Here's some more recent wall pieces that just went out for a show. Here's a new plank. This was the first piece I made after Trump was elected. It's called We're All in a Big Hole Now. And then this is the last thing. This is what I'm currently working on right now. This is a commission for a development in Northern California. In the foreground here will be fountains that project this water. And in the back, this is kind of a mirrored mosaic composition. There's a detail. So here's the piece back here. The columns have now been removed. So this is all retail, this is commercial. People will come back here, have lunch, hang out. There'll be a water fountain right in front that matches that arc. And it's all being shipped in pieces. There it is, laid out. So here are the arcs. This is regular mirror, this is smoke mirror, black mirror, and ceramic. And this was also an engineering challenge because each piece has to be like a puzzle piece. And certain pieces were left off because we have to attach it to a big wall. So in May, I'm going to do that. And that's it.
Can you expand a little bit on the relationship of the use of natural materials and the kind of the fracturing of that with these geometric shapes, and where the need to work with these materials comes from?
Well, there's two types. There's the outdoor materials, and I've learned there's some real problems with nature. It really destroys everything. And I don't like a lot of the traditional materials that you have to make work out of that goes outdoors, like bronze and steel and aluminum. And so I really love kind of painting with sculpture. So the mosaic has been the history of mosaic is so interesting because it's so old. And so that's been one material that I've really fallen in love with because it, like I told you before, it's like a skin. It creates a skin over an object. But bronze is also a great material. Some of the tension that I guess I'm interested in is that the geometric world doesn't coincide with the organic world all the time. It collides, and I kind of like that. But with contemporary materials, there's so many different materials that I'm still learning about and still working with. Fiberglass has been a really good one because it's impervious to nature, but it's toxic to work with. So with every one of them, you're either talking about money or your health. You know, there's not a lot of materials that you can afford that are healthy to work with, that are going to last. Like bronze is not healthy to pour bronze, but sometimes you have to do it. And so that's a concern, you know, is what material is right for the stone. For me is the one I've used the most because I love the organic nature of it, its origins. It's easy to cut, adhere, shape, carve. Stone's a really good one.
Where do you feel like that need comes from though? Is it like your upbringing of being, you were raised in California? Was it Southern California or Northern California?
I was raised in Northern California. I just think it's a materiality, you know. I'm just kind of stuck between a painter and a sculptor all the time. And the physicality of sculpture needs a material that kind of comes from the earth, you know, because of the subject matter. This piece, for example, is pretty glitzy as far as things I've made. It's a little bit more of a decorative solution to that space. I'm doing another one that goes back to the plants in the subway. You know, I'm going back to kind of like these nature motifs. But I guess it's the physicality of living on the land, owning land upstate, having a garden, digging in the land, you know, the physicality of stone and how it relates to me physically, you know.
So you say for some of the work you had to build a studio to make it to like fit the attributes of the work?
Well, I designed it to fit them.
Design it, okay.
Yeah.
Do you still do they sometimes outlive, like you have to move on from that, and do you still maintain those, or do they what happens if...
You mean the planks?
Yeah, if because you go back and forth, so if you have a studio space for one particular body of work, but then you're not making that work.
For this example, for this piece, I had to rent a more industrial space. I've kind of got 3 studios because I've basically 3 bodies of work, and the dust is such an issue. The painting is so precise and clean that has to be kind of in my home studio. The stonework is so dirty and dusty that it's in an industrial building in Hudson, and so I just divide the spaces, and yeah, I mean it's a constant problem as to what's going to be made where, what's going to be stored. I was talking to Mark about that. I've got 3 storage units full of art.
But you haven't had to close a space. You're still able to maintain the ones that you already have.
Yeah. I mean, it's not Brooklyn, so yeah. Yeah.
We talk a little bit about money.
Yeah.
I mean, just you and I were saying how things have changed. You can't count on galleries to do all the business work for you. You work with a lot of galleries, but I think you also, you just talk about how, I mean, because you're cranking, making a ton of work, selling a ton of work.
Yeah.
And we have a big professional practices curriculum, but I think you have a perspective to offer that our students maybe not have heard a lot yet about.
Yeah, I kind of grew up, my dad was a tenure track teacher. I got this message that I needed to get an MFA to get a teaching job. I definitely got that message. And so I did the CAAs, I got my MFA, and I kind of went down that path. But I think I always made paintings. I always made objects, and you guys should read Working Space. I know it's dated, that Frank Stella book, but I think it started with me. I started selling paintings early on, like works on paper, and I started realizing, oh shit, people buy paintings. They really buy paintings. It's the one thing historically people will buy is paintings, like they buy shoes. And so I think because I am so prolific, I build these relationships with dealers. I really do love the artist-dealer relationship, certain aspects of it. I love having someone that truly understands your work, that is in it for the economic gain it is an economy, a commerce that exists there. But those galleries and those relationships fail, and people can be dishonest, and galleries go out of business. So that model sometimes doesn't always hold true for a long career. I think to sustain it, you have to fight for everything. The way I do it is I have the site-specific projects. I have things that I apply for, like public commissions, and then I have gallery sales. And then I sell stuff out of the studio. And you never stop emailing people. You never stop sending JPEGs to people. And you just have to be kind of a self-promoter all the time. And some artists don't like to do that. Some artists think it's bullshit. They don't want to be bothered with it. They want to make the work and present it to the world. I don't think sometimes deep down I'm talented enough to just be the crazy guy on the hill that they come and take his art from him and, And I feel like you all need to be self-promoting yourself from day one. You need to believe in yourself and say, I'm a damn good artist, and you need to have this. It's kind of a self-confidence thing. It's like, there's only one of these in the world, you have to have it. It's, and it sounds like a car salesman, but I approach it in this way that I believe in my art, I believe that art will save the world, that art is important, and I believe that people should have to pay for it. And it sounds a little capitalistic and maybe a little narcissistic, but I've always had that approach that if I spend a lot of pride and I spend a lot of time making things that are beautiful or making things that say something to people, that they will buy them. You know, I kind of learned it in the Whitney program. I remember Ron Clark told me, the art world is just another economy. So much of the Whitney program was about activism. And you get to the point where you're reading so much Marxist theory that you start to question production. Like, why am I making anything to feed this economy? What's the point of this? But then about 2 years after the Whitney program, after the paralysis wears off, and Mungo and Carrie can attest to this, you enter that economy. And all of you are going to enter an economy, the art world economy, whether it's a performative art world economy or a film art world economy. And so you figure out how you're going to insert yourself into that economy. Am I going to make paintings that sell for $1 million? Maybe. Am I going to give drawings away or trade them for house cleaning? You know, there's a little economies that we're all involved in. And I guess I've embraced that part of the art world. I like those economies. I like that I'm going to sell a painting and sometimes I'm going to trade a painting, or I'm going to do this and you do that for me. I'm going to have that barter general store, and we're going to have commerce there. We're going to have an exchange. I remember John Plipchuk, when Mungo went to school with Plipchuk, he made sculptures that were $1 a piece. And he sold them out of his studio in graduate school, and he made hundreds a day, and they were $1. And I always thought that was kind of cool. He just now they're worth a lot more, but his philosophy was always like more, trade, $1. And you know, he always had beer money, you know. So I guess to answer your question, Mark, you guys should be aware of the economy that you're in, that you don't know you're in, that you're going to enter, and that your work has value. It has economic value, it has artistic value, and it has worth. And I believe that I believe people should pay a lot of money for art. I do. I think it's so valuable. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad stuff to that, but I've always had this approach that slow and expensive is kind of my motto. That if the work is good and you put your heart and your integrity into it, you should be able to charge a lot of money for it. So, but you guys could criticize that, for sure. You know, there's not an artist I know that hasn't been burned by a gallery financially. So you have to fight for yourself. Some artists, I've had many galleries close where they owe you money. That's just the reality of it. And that you have to protect yourself for in the future. Yeah?
I want to ask, how do you deal when your budget doesn't allow you to make like perfect work?
It's a good question. You just try to find the right materials, and you try to find the right solutions, you know, to do what you want to do. A good example is maybe Terrell and that crater he's been working on his entire life. And that's probably about the most ambitious thing you could possibly ever, you know, conceive of. But he's been in a position that he sells work or he does an installation to pay for it. Some people consider him a genius. Other people consider him mad, you know. But he never gave up, and the amount of integrity he has to see that project through. I had a teacher once tell me, no matter what your idea is, no matter how much it costs, find the money, spend the money, do it to complete your idea. That sacrifice whatever it takes to complete your idea. Now, if you can't pay rent and you want to make a gold painting, you know, you might want to think about reconfigure that and make it out of aluminum and patina it gold. You know, there's ways to cheat, but you kind of want to stick to your guns and say, this is what I want to make. And sometimes you get lucky and you make some money, and sometimes you don't, and it costs too much to make. Everything costs a lot more now, obviously, to make than it used to.
You work in a variety of ways. Is there one that is more personally satisfying, or do they satisfy different things?
I like these big projects because it becomes like you become like a producer, you know, and I get really jacked up like it's a concert, like you're doing this thing together. I like this kind of collaborative thing that happens. I'm not as a loner in my studio as I used to be. You know, sometimes painting is really solitary and it can be dark and you're in there grinding it out. So I need these things that are a little more lighthearted, that I can go with a crew and we can have fun. And I like the kind of cinematic part of it. But I also want like a residency within my own studio. I really want to draw again. I need to take like 6 months off and draw because I miss it so much. But I'm so ADD that these things satisfy that kind of attention deficit disorder, because you've got a common goal, you know. Thanks. Thank you.
This evening it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Jason Middlebrook to our final MFA Fine Arts talk for the 2016-17 academic year. Jason's an artist who gathers creative inspiration from both nature and technology and transfers their complex relationships into works of sculpture, installation, painting, and large-scale drawings. And lots of wood, lots of stuff on wood. Jason's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally at venues such as the New Museum of Contemporary Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, Mass MoCA in North Adams, Mass, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in Connecticut, Galleria Paolo Bonzano Arte Contemporanea in Rome, Museo de Arte de El Salvador, Nylon Gallery in London, and Charlotte Lund Gallery in Stockholm, Sweden, among many others. He was a 2010 recipient of the Joan Mitchell Foundation grant and the Pollock Krasner Foundation grant in 2016. His MTA public commission, Brooklyn Seeds, was named one of the best public art works in the United States in 2012 by the Americans for the Arts Convention. He has also worked with organizations such as RX Art, Wave Hill, the Drawing Center, Smack Melon, and many others. Jason received a BA in Fine Arts from UC Santa Cruz and an MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute in 1984, back when it was great. In 94-95, he was a participant in the Whitney Independent Study Program, and in 2009-10, he participated in the Lapsus residency in Stockholm. He has been represented by a number of excellent galleries in New York and elsewhere over the years, and he is currently represented by, try to do this all in one breath, David Smith Gallery in Denver, Gallery 16 in San Francisco, Laura Reynolds Gallery in Austin, Texas, Monica Maloche Gallery in Chicago, Ameringer, McHenry, and Yohe here in New York, Jeff Bailey Gallery in Hudson, and Gallery Pack in Milan. Please join me in welcoming Jason Middlebrook.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Thank you, Mark. All those galleries are made up. I don't work with any of those galleries. All right, so I have a lot to show you. I'm really pretty schizophrenic in my art practice. And I'm going to break things down into about 3 distinctive groups. I studied painting. My father's a sculptor. My mother is a native plant kind of advocate in California. She has a nonprofit. So I come from the West Coast. And I studied painting. I grew up in this artistic family in California. But as I evolved, I became much more of a site-specific artist. Yet I still make paintings. I still draw. I had a teacher in graduate school tell me once that I'm conceptually promiscuous. And that's kind of the best way for me to go about this. A lot of people, after they see this presentation, they say, oh my God, you're all over the place. But there's some continuity, and there's a lot of major threads that intersect one another. And I'm going to kind of just start, you're going to look at about a 10 to 12 year span of work that I've been making. This project, I'm starting at this point because it's a very site-specific project. There was a show at the MCA 2010-ish, kind of responding to Alexander Calder. The MCA has got a large kind of holding of Alexander Calder's work. They were looking at artists, contemporary artists that were responding to Calder, and so I was invited to do a project there. And I really got into the history of Chicago and how Chicago was rebuilt. Chicago was this amazing architectural kind of template after the fire. So I scanned all the neighborhoods of Chicago, and I started collecting objects throughout the neighborhoods of Chicago, and I kind of set up this criteria that I was going to just collect kind of wood, kind of an organic material that had a function in homes in Chicago and that had gone through this life and been expired and kind of dumped on the streets. So this is kind of a storage facility that I started collecting all these objects: three-legged chairs, mantles, windows, window sashes. This is a spindle for the electric company, cribs, and so I set up these kind of rules that I was going to spend weeks on end collecting this debris. A mantle. Here's some lattice. I got into a few Hyde Park, Oak Park, some of Frank Lloyd Wright's students. And so I went back to my studio and I made this kind of model in my studio that had a relationship to Calder, but it also had a relationship to the kind of debris versus this log that I found in a mill about 75 miles east of Chicago, a mill that fed Chicago through most of the turn of the century. So I picked out this kind of 2,000-pound maple log, and the idea was to try to find this equivalent amount of debris that had been discarded in Chicago. This is the model and how the sculpture would be positioned. I went back to Chicago and I started to assemble this with this kind of cluster on one side and the equivalent weight on the other. A lot of what I'm going to show you tonight